That's the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Greetings and good morning to everyone. Welcome to our courses. This is Jaku Kambit's Sankofa Community Courses in African World History, and I'm Dr. Clyde Ledbetter. I'm the facilitator of these courses, and this month we will have a special seminar on the life and legacy of Paul L. Roberson. Paul Roberson, one of the greatest figures in African world history in the 20th century. And we're going to talk about his life. We're going to talk about his talents, which he had an enormous amount of. But most importantly, we're going to talk about his commitment to freedom and his commitment to the development of African people, and also his just love and desire to see the uplift of humanity, particularly working class people, and how, because of that, because of his commitment to freedom, he was ostracized by the U.S. government, by the entertainment industry, and other folks, other entities. So we're going to talk about this life of this incredibly talented man. We'll talk about his times and how he was connected to some of the seminal events and movements in African world history in the 20th century. And actually, we'll go back a little bit and talk about the 19th century. We'll talk about his family and how important they were. So as we get started with this seminar, this will be 4 weeks. Normally our major courses that we have during the year are 8-week courses, and then throughout the year we have these 4-week seminars on particular topics. So we started this cycle in July. We had our course on African World History Part 1. We'll have this seminar in September, and in October we will have our 8-week Shiro's course that goes through October and November. And then in December and January, we'll have another special seminar dealing with the history of the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath. So we'll talk about Haiti in December and January. But today, Paul Leroy Robeson. Paul Leroy Robeson. 1898, 1976 are his years, and we're going to talk about him over the next 4 weeks. This seminar, is dedicated to Charles L. Blockson, who just passed away in June of this year. Mr. Blockson was the founder of the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection at Temple University. When I was a graduate student at Temple, I had the pleasure of working there for a number of years, and I got to meet Mr. Blockson, and Paul Roberson was his idol. In fact, if you go into the Charles L. Blockson collection at Temple, there's a reading room where you can use the materials there and learn about the African experience and the African world experience. If you go in that reading room and you sit at one of the tables, you can sit underneath this portrait that Mr. Blockson had of himself and Paul Roberson looking over his shoulder, because he looked up to this man. Charles L. Blockson was born and grew up in Norrisville, Pennsylvania, and when he was a young child, he was in class, and the teacher told him that black people contributed nothing to world civilization and were essentially just made to be servants of whites. And this is what he told him. He was born in 1933, so this was probably in the late 30s, early 1940s that he was told this as a young child. Well, Mr. Blockson grew up, and actually not even before he grew up, while he was still a child, he took what this teacher said and he wanted to prove this teacher wrong. So every time he got allowance or he got a little bit of money, instead of buying candy or buying toys, he would buy books. He would buy magazines and articles, anything that talked about African American history. And while he was doing all of this, he looked up to Paul Roberson. And we'll talk about why he, as well as millions of other black youth and black people all over the world, looked up to Paul Roberson during this time. Mr. Blockson would eventually amass a collection with hundreds of thousands of books, articles, art pieces, sheet music, photographs, everything documenting the African American experience and the African world experience, and eventually donate those materials to Temple University as well as his alma mater, Penn State University. So he actually has 2 collections, the larger one being at Temple. He became an ancestor earlier, a couple of months ago in June, and I just want to dedicate this seminar to him for all his contributions to preserving our history and for his love of Paul Roberson. So this is who this seminar is dedicated to. As always, in my seminars and courses, I've been joined by my teaching assistant, Daniel Roberson III. He's a graduate student at Temple University. He knows the Blockson collection well. And I just want him to show a quick video that introduces Paul Roberson to you, because many of you might not even know who Paul Roberson is. In fact, actually, before we show that video, I want to just do something for the folks that are on the Zoom. Raise your hand if you know who Paul Roberson was. Raise your hand if you've heard this name, if it sounds familiar, or type in the chat if you never heard of Paul Roberson at all. You can say no, you can say yes. I just kind of want to get a general feel of what we have going on in the chat. And since we've been in the studio, and we're still here at BIA Media, 235 Montreal Road, as you saw in the opening credits. If you need anything in terms of videography, photography, podcasting, this is the place to go if you're black in Ottawa, or if you're anywhere else, but definitely if you're black. Let me just see what we got. I see one hand up, and in the chat, I see, no, first time hearing about him, only heard his name. Okay, in this class, outside of, okay, so I've talked about him a few times in this course, which is actually the impetus for why I'm doing this seminar, because I mentioned him a number of times. But that's not atypical, that only a few people have heard of Paul Roberson, even though during the early part of his career, he was probably one of the most famous people, not just black folks, famous people in the world during his time. But because of his activism, because of his commitment to freedom, he not only was ostracized in his life, but even after his death, historians and other folks have attempted to erase his legacy. Or if they talk about his legacy, they only talk about him as an artist and not as an activist, or not what he stood for, not who he was. So we're going to clear a lot of that up over the next 3 weeks. And it's important to know about Paul Roberson, not because of his talents. And we're going to, again, talk about, and let me stop by saying this. I'm going to mention a lot of things about Paul Roberson over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And you might not believe me. Because when I first heard about Paul Roberson when I was younger, I was like, how could one person be that talented at so many different things? These must be myths. This can't be real. But everything I'm going to say to you, there's evidence for. And a lot of that evidence will be placed on the course website associated with this seminar. So as with all of our courses and seminars, there's a website that you can go to. It's completely free, with articles, newspaper clippings, book chapters, full books that cover the life and legacy of Paul Roberson. So the information I'm going to talk about this man, the important thing that I want you to keep in mind, his commitment to freedom. Because it's so much more important than anything that he actually does with his talent. It's a commitment to freedom. All of us, most of us aren't a tenth as talented as Paul Roberson. But all of us, everybody watching this, can make a commitment to freedom, can make a commitment to use whatever talent you have, because we all have some talent. We're not as talented as Mr. Roberson. But whatever we have, whatever skills that we have, put it to use to freedom the way Paul Roberson does. So I'm kind of giving a conclusion to the course and what I want folks to take out of it before we get into it. But let me just introduce you to him very quickly so you can kind of see the man that we're talking about. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that interview. And this is an interview from later in his career in 1960. Where Paul Roberson is giving this interview, and I think it's to an Australian TV network.
How is it that the American Negro, who for so long has been a second-class citizen in the United States,
I'm sorry.
how is it that he's contributed so much to American culture?
Well,
Music, dance, everything you can think
well,
of.
I have to be very modest about that. I would say certainly as we look at the African peoples in Nigeria, for example, I just got a wonderful invitation to go to Nigeria to be present at the installation at the Governor General Ezekwe, an old friend, who now, and I had to cable him. I'm in Australia. I certainly would like to be with you, but I'm out here with some good folks. But I'll get to Nigeria later.
Mr. Roberson, do you feel that Africa is to some extent an affinity for it, a home, or do you still feel America is essentially your home? How do you feel?
Well, let me come here. I'll come to that in just a second. But to come back to it, so I would say the Africans and the American Negroes have turned out to be an extraordinarily gifted people. The great tragedy is that by not making us full-class citizens as yet in America, they may be losing, I don't know how much yet. And to come back, I would say that unquestionably, I am an American, born there. My father slaved there upon on the backs of my people was developed the primary wealth of America. The primary wealth. You have to have accumulated wealth to start, to build. You did it another way here in Australia. You had to build your accumulated wealth too. You just came and took it. You know what I mean? And that's what they did in most of the countries. That's what you Europeans did. You just took it. We got to catch up with you a little bit. That's so in America. So there's a lot of America that belongs to me yet. You understand? But just like a Scottish American is proud of being from Scotland, I'm proud for being African. Now, in our school books, they tried to tell me that all Africans were savages, till I got to London and found most of the Africans I knew were going to Oxford and Cambridge and doing very well, and learned their culture. And even once somebody had the temerity, after one had conquered the Chinese people and imposed upon them the opium trade and everything else, to suggest that they were backward people, just the people who had been civilized so long. Over the rest of you folks didn't make any sense at all. So somewhere, it was wonderful to find about the colored peoples of the world that they were very advanced. So I would say today that I'm an American who is infinitely prouder to be of African descent, no question about it. No question about it. I'm an Afro-American, and I don't use the word American ever loosely again.
Now this was the feeling.
That's right.
That when you were in London about 1937, 38, you really had the world at your feet then. I mean, you had tremendous success. You were recognised over the world, and yet you went back to America. This was the feeling that took you back?
I felt I had to go back to my people. That's right. The going was tough, and today I can go back. I just had my passport renewed. I could go back to pretty tough times now. But any time I could get a telegram next week that the Negro people had gathered somewhere in one of their conferences, as they could, and say, Paul, in the difficulties that are going on in America, would you come back and help us? I would take the plane as soon as I finished my engagements.
Thank you, Daniel. So that short clip, you can get a sense of how Paul Robeson saw the world, saw himself as an African, but also saw himself connected to the struggle of African-American people for progress. And talking about he had a stake in America because his father had was enslaved there. And we'll talk about that in a second. So this is who this man was. You see, just through that brief interview, his fearlessness, because he's in Australia, and he didn't sugarcoat. He said, you came and you stole the land, just like the rest of you Westerners. And then you saw the little nervous laughs of the host. But this is how this man was. He told history just like it was. He talked about Chinese folks. He talked about Scottish folks, because he understood what oppression means around the world, and that it was important to be on the side of the oppressed. This is how Paul Robeson lived his life. And he mentioned a couple of things in that interview, how his passport just got renewed, and it's 1960 when this interview was given. We'll talk about how his passport was taken away soon. But that's who Paul Robeson was, and we haven't even begun to talk about his talent. So this week, we're going to focus on Paul Robeson as the scholar and the athlete. Paul Robeson as a scholar and athlete. So we're going to cover the years 1898 to 1923. We're going to discuss Paul Robeson's family. You're going to hear me slip a couple times. The actual pronunciation of his name is Robeson. Robeson, like Robe son. But when it comes out, sometimes it comes out as Robeson, but it's Robeson. Robeson. We're going to talk about how his family prepared him for his life's work. None of these people that are great in our society, in our history, just emerge by themselves. Oftentimes they come from very strong parents and very strong family backgrounds. And we're going to talk about Paul Robeson's. We're going to talk about the social conditions of the African world during this period of his life. And we're going to talk about just how good Robeson was as a scholar and an athlete during this time, because he was phenomenal in both spheres, as both a scholar and an athlete, top tier in both. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to start with his family. And you might seem like I'm spending a lot of time with this, but it's incredibly important to show that, again, people don't just emerge. They're formed. They're formed in families. And this is the first learning crucible of many of our great leaders. It starts with his father, William D. Robeson. It starts with his mother, Mary Louisa Robeson, whose maiden name was Bastille. And that Bastille family is incredibly important in the history of African Americans. And we'll talk about them in a second. But I want to start with his father, who was born enslaved in North Carolina. There's some family history that says he was of Igbo descent. I don't know how they figured that out, but that's what they said. That's what the family says. Paul Robeson's father was born in slavery in North Carolina. and actually escaped slavery at the age of 15 by taking the Underground Railroad, made famous by people like William Steele, Harriet Tubman, and others. This network of abolitionists that helped enslaved Africans escape to the north, either to the north of the U.S. or into Canada during the 19th century, first half of the 19th century. So he was one of these Africans, him alongside of his brother. At the age of 15, loved freedom so much that they were willing to go from North Carolina, which is not the upper South. This is not like Maryland where you just go a couple of miles and you're in Pennsylvania to freedom. This is where Frederick Douglass came from, Harriet Tubman came from. They came from Maryland, which is just south of this tan line. Or even Virginia. This is North Carolina. So you have to go a ways. You have to go through 2 to 3 southern states before you get to Pennsylvania. So he was able to escape on the Underground Railroad and make his way to Philadelphia. At the time, in 1860, this is right before the Civil War, Philadelphia is home to the largest population of free African people in the United States. It is a hub of burgeoning African-American culture. When he gets to Philadelphia, he works as a laborer, and eventually he enrolls in Lincoln University. At the time, it was called Ashman Institute. Actually, no, by the time he enrolls, it would have been Lincoln University. He goes to Lincoln University, the oldest historically black college in the United States. It happens to be my alma mater as well. At the time, it was an all-men's school designed to train black men to become Presbyterian ministers. So he gets a degree from Lincoln. He gets a master's degree in theology from Lincoln. So he goes from being enslaved, escaping, working, and becomes a pastor, Presbyterian minister with a master's degree from Lincoln University. While he's there at Lincoln University, he meets and marries Mary Louisa Bastille, who was a teacher, who was a master at various languages, and importantly, she came from the Bastille family. In Philadelphia, the Bastille family was one of the prominent African-American families during the 18th and 19th century. The progenitor, Cyrus Bastille, was an enslaved African man. He was enslaved in New Jersey, but he was able to learn the skill of baking. He became a chef and a baker. And he was able to there's some debate on this, whether he bought his freedom or he was given freedom. But he was enslaved and he became part of the Quaker community. Quakers were a religious movement I think it's originally started in Germany, and they came over to the U.S. for religious freedom, and a lot of them settled in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio region. And they were some of the first abolitionists. Now, many of them owned slaves at the beginning of during their first years in the U.S., but eventually, because of their conscience wouldn't allow them, these are white folks, their conscience wouldn't allow them to hold slaves anymore. So many of them started to free the slaves that they had, and then they became staunch abolitionists, saying that slavery is wrong morally and we should stop doing this. So Cyrus Bastille became a black Quaker because he saw that the Quakers, many of them held to their conviction of slavery being morally wrong. A lot of them didn't give up their racism, though, and one of his descendants will talk about that. But Cyrus Bastille became a Quaker. But not only that, his baked goods helped feed the army of George Washington. And George Washington was so grateful during the American Revolution that he actually gifted Cyrus Bastille with a pendant, a silver pendant that was still in the family for a while. I don't know if the family still has it or not, or they donated it to a museum. But Cyrus Bastille was also of indigenous descent. He was African and indigenous. And when he marries an indigenous woman. And then they start this Bastille family. Even though they're of mixed lineage, they always identify with being African. And in fact, Cyrus Bastille was one of the founders of the Free African Society in Philadelphia. The Free African Society. This was a group of black men and women that got together in Philadelphia, and they said, we need to support ourselves. There's too much racism and segregation in Philadelphia. Slavery is still going on because this is the early 19th century. So we're going to form a mutual aid society called the Free African Society. You'll notice that so many things in the U.S. during this time, the early 19th century, early 1800s, have African in it. Anything they became very prominent. Wealthy, but more importantly, they were all activists, and they all cared about the uplift of the African race, as it was called. One of his granddaughters, Sarah Mapp Douglas, became an educator at the Institute for Colored Youth, another institution that says that they are the oldest historically black college in the United States. And they're really close to Lincoln. They're about 20 minutes apart. I teach at Cheney. I've been teaching at Cheney. Now it's called Cheney University, but back then it was called the Institute for Colored Youth. I've been teaching there for 10 years, online for the past 7 since I've been at Ottawa. But I've been at Cheney for over 10 years, and I love that institution, but I graduated from Lincoln, so there's no doubt in my mind which one is the first. But anyway, Sarah Map Douglas was one of the educational leaders at this institute that was churning out black teachers. So at this time, there's only 2 black colleges in the country, and they're both right outside of Philadelphia, the Institute for Colored Youth and Lincoln University, and his family's connected to both. Sarah Map Douglas was also an artist. She was also a writer. She was one of the founders of an anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. She fought for women's rights. One of Paul Robeson's aunts, Gertrude Bastille Moselle, again, another educator, another writer, a journalist, early feminist, and this was his aunt, his mother's sister. So his mother's family, the Bastilles, incredibly talented, and these are just the women. I haven't mentioned Robert Douglas Jr., who was Sarah Map Douglas's brother, was one of the earliest recognized African-American artists. He was a painter and a portraiteur. So you had immense talent on both sides of his family. But most importantly, both sides of his family were committed to freedom. And they were committed because these women lived during and after the Civil War. Before the Civil War and during the Civil War, this entire Bastille family was involved in the Underground Railroad, shepherding people from bondage to freedom. They probably were connected to William Robeson's escape in some type of way, because he had to come through Philadelphia where this family was so prominent. One of the things, however, though, with this family, as much as prominent as they were very classist, and some segments of the family were very colorist. So when Mary Louisa marries William Robeson, the formerly enslaved William Robeson, the family didn't really like that. They thought that, you know, this man was beneath her station in a lot of ways. So you had some tension with that as well. So for as much credit as I give the Bastilles, there still was a little class element involved in that as well. But they married and they had children. They had William Jr., Benjamin, a brother named Reed, and a sister named Marion, and Paul Robeson was the youngest of their children. William Robeson would go on to pastor a couple of churches. First, a Presbyterian church in Princeton, New Jersey. This is where Paul Robeson was born, in Princeton. He grew up there for a little bit of his childhood. This was an incredibly segregated city in New Jersey. Princeton is, you know, the home of Princeton University, and a lot of Southerners would come up to Princeton University to get their education. And they would bring that Southern mentality. And I'm not saying the North was slightly less racist. It wasn't a racialized place. It was incredibly racist, but not as much as the South. So these Southerners are used to a certain type of lifestyle, and they like having black people take care of them. So the university would employ black maids, and even the community around the university. A lot of black people working as domestics, and they were there to serve the white folks. Well, as the black folks grew in number to form these functions to work as laborers and domestics, they needed their own outlets, their own community organizations. And the church of William Robeson, he was one of these key institutions. At this time, and we're talking about 1898 into the early 20th century, black teachers and black clergymen were the top leaders in the black community. You also had Pullman porters that were a very prestigious position to have as a black man and things, but the teacher and the preacher were the top of the occupational aspirations for black folks. So his mother was a teacher, his father was a preacher. William Robeson would take his son with him to church to help him and listen to him preach. And Paul Robeson will grow up, as you saw in just that short interview, his speaking voice is one of the most recognizable and most powerful in American history. And that comes from seeing his father. And actually, sometimes later on in his life, when his father would be sick or out of town, he would actually give sermons. This is going to help him in another aspect of his career that I'll mention later on. So William Robeson had a church in Princeton. He was eventually driven out of that church because he was a little bit too forceful in his attacks on racism. And he eventually gets another church in Westfield, New Jersey, and then in Summerfield, New Jersey. But before he leaves Princeton, something very tragic happens. When Paul Robeson is 6 years old, his mother dies. His mother dies a very violent death. His mother had cataracts in her eyes, and she was essentially blind. And one day, she was home with one of her sons and Robeson, who was 6, and she was about to clean the rug. And there was a stove on top of the rug. She asked one of her sons to lift up either she was lifting up the stove or the son was lifting up the stove to pull the rug out the way so they could clean it. And, back then you fed stoves with coal. One of the coals fell out, it got onto a dress. And, back then women wore those large dresses with a lot of fabric. Dress caught on fire, and before the young son could figure out what to do, 80% of her body had been burned, and she actually lived a couple of days after in extreme agony and then finally passed away. Paul Robeson was home when this happened, but a lot of scholars, including his son, feel as though he blocked a lot of that out of his mind. It's a very tragic event for a 6-year-old to go through, and his mother passes away. Now, already, his father was in his 50s when he had Paul. Paul's the youngest. So that father and then his brothers and sisters became the primary caretakers for Paul. So when he sang that great Negro spiritual, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, that was real to him because he lived most of his life as a motherless child. His mother died at 6 years old. So his father is tasked with raising him, and he does a good job, as he did with all his children. All his children become successful, except one becomes a kind of a laborer, and he kind of dies in poverty. But the other ones, one becomes a pastor, one becomes a doctor, his sister becomes incredibly influential, Miriam. So his children become and then Paul becomes Paul. So he stressed excellence in his household. And he stressed a burning desire in his children to be intellectually capable and also committed to their race and committed to building the African race. So he actually switches churches, switches denominations, and he goes on to be one of the leading members in the AME Zion Church. And his brother, Paul Robeson's brother, William's son, becomes one of the leading pastors in the church as well. And it was actually belief early in his life that Paul Robeson will become a pastor just like his father. He doesn't quite go down that route, but like I said, there are times where he does fill in for his father and give sermons. As he's growing up and he's being tutored by his brothers and his father, and he's learning things and he's excelling in school, and they move to Somerville, New Jersey, and he's attending white schools. Princeton was segregated. There was a black school that he went to when he was really young. But by the time the family moves to Somerville, New Jersey, he's going to a mixed school. And for the most part, he's treated relatively well, except by the principal. This principal named Dr. Ackerman. Dr. Ackerman hated Paul Robeson because he hated black people. And Paul Robeson would succeed academically, athletically, in the glee club, in dramas when they put on little plays at school, and the principal would hate it. And anytime he found some type of way to castigate Paul Robeson, he would. If Paul Robeson messed up any little way, the principal was on him. And earlier in his academic career, Paul Robeson said that his father had given the teachers permission to, give him corporal punishment if need be, if he acted up. And this is not unheard of in those days. People would get paddled at school. This is what happened back in those days. But Paul Robeson came home one day, and he told his father, he said, "Look, Dad, I know you gave the teachers permission to hit me if I act up, but I'm telling you right now, if Mr. Ackerman touches me, I'm gonna hurt this man. I'm gonna really hurt this man." And his father knew, because he wasn't a bad kid, so his father knew that, okay, I'm not gonna let Ackerman do anything to my son, because at this point in high school, Paul Robeson is already starting to grow, and he's about 6 foot. So he's probably as big as Ackerman anyways. He probably would have messed him up pretty bad. But for the most part, he's excelling in school. He's doing well academically. He's learning to play multiple sports. His brothers are coaching him, and his brothers are a lot older. So one is 18 years older than him, William Jr. He has a brother named Ben, and both of these brothers are incredibly in touch with training their young brother to be the best academically as well as athletically. So he's learning basketball. He's learning football. He's learning track. He's learning baseball. He's playing all these sports, and he's getting really good at the sports and getting really good grades. He's in oratorical contests where he's giving speeches. He's in a glee club where he's a soloist. So from the early age, he can sing, he can act, he's getting good grades, and he's a multi-sport athlete. So much so that in his senior year in high school, he is recognized throughout the state as being one of the best football players. He's already over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds, and he's dominating, so much so that other teams are ganging up on him. And actually in his senior year, in one of the games, he's getting gang tackled because he's playing fullback. He's getting gang tackled by kids, by 4 or 5 kids ganging up on him at a time. He actually breaks his nose and his collarbone in a game in his senior year because the teams, and they couldn't stop. He still scored like 2 touchdowns in that game. This is how good he was. But it was really on the defensive end that he shined, because they said he would hit people and you would hear it crack like thunder when Paul Roberson would hit people, even as a high school student. His senior year, something really important happens. It's announced that there's going to be this statewide exam, and the student that scores the highest on this exam will be able to attend Rutgers University in New Jersey for free on a scholarship. Now, up until this point, Paul Robeson had in his mind that he was going to go to Lincoln University, like his father and actually his brother William Jr. had went to Lincoln University. So he just assumed, I'm going to Lincoln, just the family legacy. But Lincoln wasn't offering scholarships. Lincoln cost money. And although his father was a well-respected minister, it's not like they were wealthy. And again, his father is getting up there in age. So it's not like the family is balling out of control. So he's like, if I can get a free scholarship to this school, I might as well take it. Now, Rutgers at this time is one of the oldest universities in the United States. And Paul Robeson, if he gets in, he'll be about the 3rd black person to attend this all-male university. It's an all-male university, a couple of 100 students, but very prestigious university. So he has to take this entrance exam. One problem arises. That principal, Dr. Ackerman, he knew about this exam. He knew about this exam a year before. And some students had taken this exam, and this exam was going to test everything that you learned in your 4 years of high school. Well, the year before, certain students took this exam, and they were able to be tested on the first 3 years of things that they learned. And then in the second portion of the test would be the next year, and they would only have to be tested on 1 year's worth of knowledge. But because Dr. Ackerman didn't tell Paul Robeson about the initial test, Paul had to take the entire 4 years in the same amount of time that the other students were just taking 1 year's worth of examination. So he's sitting in the room and understanding this. His brothers had trained him. His father had trained him. He prepared his butt off for this test. Already at a handicap because of not knowing about the previous exam. He goes in there and he aces it. Gets the highest grade in the entire state. So when Paul Robeson goes to Rutgers University, it's not on an athletic scholarship. It's not because of his prowess on the football field. It's because of his intellect. So for Rutgers, for its part, on one hand said, well, he did it. We didn't think of this little black kid was. I mean, they didn't have any formal segregation at Rutgers because they just never assumed that a black person would be able to pass the exam. And Dr. Ackerman sure didn't want Paul to pass. He was trying to literally hold him back. But he proved him wrong. And he gets in, and Rutgers accepts him. But when he gets to Rutgers, they say, well, nobody wants to room with you, so you have to find your own accommodations because no white student would room with him. So he lived with a black family in New Brunswick during his time at Rutgers. But right before he graduated, right before he goes to Rutgers, and it's just him as a young man. You see him in football, you see him looking astute as a scholar, and then you also see him on the basketball court because he played basketball, football, baseball, track, and excelled at all of these things. Right before he graduated high school, though, he did enter another oratorical contest. He would come in 3rd because he got cheated, but he always remembered the roar of the crowd when he read this poem, read this speech. It was a speech contest. He read this speech by Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist, who wrote a speech about Toussaint L'Ouverture. Paul Robeson read this speech in front of a mostly white audience. And part of the speech was, my children, France comes to make us slaves. God gave us liberty. France has no right to take it away. burn the cities, destroy the harvest, tear up the roads with cannon, poison the wells, show the white man the hell he comes to make. So he's giving this rousing speech about one of the greatest African revolutionaries, Toussaint Louverture, in a room full of white people in the early 1900s. He comes in third, but the people applaud. So he reflects on this later in life, because at the time when he's giving it, he's a high school student, and he says it probably was the older brother that told him to read it. But he says the significance of this, giving a speech about an African revolutionary and the high level and the high significance that Africans around the world placed on Haiti, and Toussaint Louverture in particular, during this time period, shouldn't have been overlooked. That's what he writes in his books. A lot of what I'm talking about today over the next couple of weeks, as I stop for a minute before we take our break, comes from a number of books. One, Paul Roberson wrote a book called Here I Stand. It covers the early part of his life as well as his struggles in the later part of his life with the U.S. government. So a lot of the information comes from Here I Stand. It's actually by Paul Roberson. All these books were readily available. The other information will come largely from a 2-volume work done by his son, Paul Roberson Jr. Paul Roberson, The Undiscovered Paul Roberson, An Artist's Journey, 1898 to 1939, and then the second one, Quest from Freedom, 1939 to 1976. These 2 volumes on Roberson's life are available at bookstores. You get it from a black store, get it from a black bookstore, and they're written by his son. So he has a lot of the letters written by his family, a lot of things to recreate the history of his father. So I recommend those 2 books. We'll stop and take a break before we get into his time at Rutgers and his professional athletic career and the times around that. So I'll open it up for any questions or comments for this first half, and then we will continue. Any questions so far? David H., go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you. I was wondering if, when you were discussing the Robeson's father raising successful children, by which standard is this success measured? A European standard or other cultures?
I was talking mostly about, when I say successful in that all of them had a desire to serve the race. And I say that in the way that they would say it during that time period, because that's what they were called. They were race men and race women. They decided to use whatever talents that they had to help further black people and black freedom. But so success, that's how I would measure it. But also in just general success as using their talents in a way that's helping them to take care of their families. So you had doctors, you had a pastor. They all were of service, is really what I'm getting at. And they all were good people. And I think those are what, when I talk about success and parents putting that into their children, and I look at the example of Paul Robeson and his father, and we've had previous seminars, we talked about Malcolm X and his father, Martin Luther King Jr. and his father, being that present in your children's life and taking them with you when you have events. And when my son's old enough, he'll be right in his class. Right now, he's about to be 2. I can't bring him because he'll just be running around and he's too much into his Hulk smash phase of his life. But when he's older, he'll be right here, because it's important to not only tell your children, but also to show them what it is that you're doing and how to move in this life. And I think that's what I was getting at when I mentioned that. So that's the standard that I'm talking about when I say success.
Thank you.
Gina, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks. So I realize that in some of the books that you've referenced, there might be a bit more detail about how Paul Robeson actually responded emotionally and psychologically to what he was coming up against. But I'm curious, given what you've shared already, do the books reference, what he had to navigate emotionally and psychologically going through all of this opposition? Because to know that you have so much potential and to still be faced with everything he has been faced with, every roadblock. When you mentioned the exam he had to take and the fact that he had to do 4 years worth of work in one sitting, and to know that that was intentionally done despite him having demonstrated his potential, Like, has that been mentioned, like how he responded emotionally, psychologically to what he was navigating? I know sometimes people are predisposed to be more like optimistic, and to be a bit more resilient. But I don't know if maybe his family, just his family support was what got him through, or the community in general.
It's definitely his family. He always leaned on his family for support. And to answer your question, I want to answer it specifically about that, because he writes about that in Here I Stand. He says, well, I won the scholarship. And here was a decisive point in my life, that I would go to Rutgers was the least of it. For I was sure I'd be happier at Lincoln. So he said he didn't even want it, but it was going to take a financial strain off of his family, so that's why he decided to go to Rutgers. He said the important thing was this. Deep in my heart from that day on was a conviction which none of the Ackermans of America would ever be able to shake. Equality might be denied, but I knew I was not inferior. So every time he would achieve, he would put in his mind, like, they could throw whatever they want at me, but I know because of how I've been brought up, because of what I'm able to do with my talent, that I'm not inferior to anyone. And his father always told him, because his father, again, was born enslaved. He knew the psychology of white folks. A lot of enslaved Africans, and even today, we know white people more than white people know us. But his father would tell him, he said, Paul, I want you to strive for excellence. I want you to be great at the things that you do. But when you're dealing with white folks, you can be better than them, but don't embarrass them. And above all, don't give them reason to fear you. Don't embarrass them, and he wasn't telling this this is the early 1900s. Those two things could get a black man killed. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Don't embarrass white people, and don't give them reason to fear you. And as he was growing up larger and larger, he ends up being about 6'4", close to 230-pound man. Don't give them reason to fear you, because you could die. You could be lynched. You could be killed. So Roberson always knew that. So internally, as a young man, he's dealing with all of these slights, not being able to ruin anybody at Rutgers, constantly being aware of his social surroundings. Even when he's in high school and he goes to that mixed school, he's not going to the little school functions, the dances. He would never go because he said he knew something, I forget how he worded it, but he said something, he knew something unfortunate might happen if he showed up in these spheres. So he might be able to visit some of his white friends' homes and things like that, but social interaction, particularly with white young women, no, because that would cause issues. So he's living through all of this, but he's rooted in the example of his family from both sides. And that Bustille family, they would have these huge family reunions, and all these folks in the Bustille family were wealthy and successful black folks and doing great things. So we had all these examples and rooted in that tradition. And that would give him the psychological makeup to go through these things. And we're going to talk about some more of the things that he goes through in a second, because he's going to need that fortitude for what comes up right when he gets to Rutgers. But yeah, that's how he dealt with these things. And he writes a lot about that. And he was a journaler. He journaled a lot. So in the books written by his son had access to these journals. And particularly later on in his life, you get to experience a lot of his internal thoughts and strivings. Okay. So there's a lot of that. And particularly the letters that he writes, particularly to his wife, and we'll get into that stuff next week, you get a lot of that. Definitely.
Yeah, it's funny how what his family advised him has changed.
Yes.
I would say that advice still stands.
I think so. I think so. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. The interview that Paul did with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, I had seen it before. And the first time I saw it, my admiration and respect for the man grew, because when they were talking about the foundation of generational wealth, he said, we had to work for us.
Right.
Whereas you, European, just came in and you took it. Yeah. And nothing much has really changed. But I thought it was very brave of him to say that. And the other thing I want to say is that white people have long known this nonsense about intellectual inferiority is something of their own creation, because that's not true. If it were true, why would they go to such an extent to put all kind of roadblocks and impediments in the ways of Black people achievements? I mean, as James Brown said it, I don't want anybody to give me nothing. Just open the door and I'll get it myself. But they knew that this lie they were telling couldn't stand up if they left the door wide open, so they put all kind of roadblocks in our way. And that's my comment.
Yes, sir. That's it. Yeah, if Africans are intellectually inferior, why ban them reading? It really is an incredible contradiction. So, the year 1915, the year that Paul Roberson enrolls in Rutgers University. What's going on in the world in 1915? So the great European tribal war, the first one, is unfolding. They call it World War I. I call it the Great European Tribal War Part 1. But in the States, the number one film that would be the number one film moving forward, as considered one of the first great blockbusters, one of the first great pieces of American cinema, is D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, based off of the book written by a white man named Dixon called The Klansman. This book was supposedly about Reconstruction, about what happened after the Civil War and what happened in the South. And according to Dixon and D.W. Griffith's film, the South was taken over by blacks that ran the Reconstruction governments in the South, and they were corrupt. And then they were assisted by these northern carpetbaggers that came to exploit the South. And the only thing that redeemed the South, that got it back, was the emergence of the heroic Ku Klux Klan that was able to put these blacks back in their place and to kick out the northern carpetbaggers and redeem the South. So when this movie came out in 1915, this is what the nation was thinking about. This was the time of the minstrel show, the blackface caricatures of black people that were popular entertainment for white folks. So if you're a white person, it's a Friday night, Saturday night, you might go to the minstrel show to see white performers, just like the guy that wrote O Canada, go out, blacken their faces and do these caricatures of black people. Or you could go to the movie theater and see D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which ends with this rousing, heroic saving of a white woman from being raped by this brutal black. A white man in blackface. So this is how they view black men, as the rapists, as the animalistic predator. And in fact, if you didn't want to go to the minstrel show, see it on the stage, if you didn't want to go to the movie theater and the cinema, then in certain places in the United States, in the Midwest and the South, you could go to a lynching. This is from 1916, so it was a year after Paul Roberson enrolls in Rutgers University. Somewhere around 15,000 people in Waco, Texas, watched the lynching, the burning, the mutilation of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas in 1916. This is actually an image. And they would take images like this of black men mutilated, burned, castrated, all of these things, and sell postcards of it. So this is when Paul Robeson's father was saying, don't embarrass, don't give white people reason to fear you. This is what he's talking about. This is what he's mentioning. So Robeson's coming into university as an athlete, as a scholar, and this is the backdrop. This is what's going on in America in 1915. This is also the year that the United States decides to invade Haiti, by the way. This is also the time where Africa is under colonization. So we're seeing all this happen while he's going into Rutgers. And I mention him as an athlete because that's also important as well. So he's coming into Rutgers with this famed athletic background, and probably the most famous black athlete at the time was this man, Jack Johnson, who had lost his heavyweight title, I think, in 1913, but he became the first black heavyweight champion in 1908 when he defeated Tommy Burns. In 1910, the whites got a big white man out of retirement named Jim Jeffries, who had never been knocked down in a fight. And he was going to be the great white hope to beat this Negro, Jack Johnson, for the world's heavyweight title. And they wanted Johnson beat not just because he was black, because of his audacity. Jack Johnson was the prototypical athlete that you see today. All that stuff started with Jack Johnson. Dressing fly as possible, Jack Johnson. Everything he wore was tailored. Driving the nicest and fastest cars, Jack Johnson. Messing around with white women, Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson, at the time where black men are being lynched and brutalized for looking at white women and being accused of, Jack Johnson is traveling the world and the United States openly with white women. And then knocking out white men in the ring with a gold tooth. A big chocolate bald black man knocking out white men, riding around with white women in the 19-teens. Public enemy number one. This film, the film of his fight with Jeffries, was actually the most watched film in America before 1915, before Birth of a Nation. So for the 5 years after, so you can imagine the psyche of white America. You got this black man knocking out, and he didn't just knock him out like in the first round. He was beating on this white man, and because they would fight for like 45 rounds back in these times during boxing. It wasn't just a 15-round fight. They'd fight 45 rounds. He knocks him out in round 26. He could have knocked him out in round 3. He's holding him up. You can see in the film, he's holding this man up so he could punish him more. And he's smiling into the camera. This is who this man was. He's holding this man up, smiling into the camera and pummeling him. The actual footage of the knockout actually gets cut. White people couldn't stand it. When this footage got out and people would watch the film of this fight in movie theaters, there were riots all over the country. All over the country. And so much so that the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt at the time said, I don't want any more boxing shown because as long as there's a black heavyweight champion, he's knocking people out, it's going to cause riots because white people just can't take it psychologically that this is happening. So this is 1915. 1915, he comes into Rutgers, and this is the state of the black athlete. They're thinking about Jack Johnson. The top 3 sports in America at this time are baseball, boxing, and horse racing. Those are the top 3. Since the late 1800s, the people that were dominating horse racing, black jockeys. Black jockeys dominated the Kentucky Derby, so much so that they put a color line in horse racing, no more black jockeys, because the black jockeys were that dominant. I think 13 out of the 15 first Kentucky Derby winners were black jockeys, because black people knew horses and they knew how to ride them. They banned blacks from horse racing. They banned blacks from baseball, of course. Baseball used to be integrated, then they banned blacks, and it wouldn't be until 1947 where Jackie Robinson enters Major League Baseball. And then in boxing, after they were finally able to get the title away from Jack Johnson, I think in 1913, they wouldn't have another black heavyweight champion again until Joe Louis in the 1930s. They kept black people essentially out from the heavyweight championship. So this is the state of the black athlete when Roberson enters Rutgers University in 1915. 1915, he tries out for the football team. He actually wasn't even going to play football. The coach sought him out and said, you should try out for the team. Because when the coach, who was named Wagner, who was one of the early pioneers of football, actually. You know, he came up with a lot of things like the 11-man roster, a lot of the rules for modern football, because football went through a lot of different iterations. But he heard about that. Of course, he knew about Roberson because of his high school exploits, but when he heard he was coming to Rutgers, he got excited. But his team, the white team said, we don't want to play with a black kid. We don't want this black kid on the team. So there was a near mutiny on the team, so he couldn't invite Paul to preseason workouts. But he went to Paul and said, you know, at the beginning of the season, you know, we have this other thing you could try out for the team when the season starts. And maybe when we get you on the field and they see how good you are, maybe I can convince the players that you should be on the team. So he goes out for the team. He goes out for the trials. And here's what happens day 1 of the trials. Actually, this is the part. All right. Day 1 of the trials, the coach puts him on the left end. This is the position that he would end up playing. He would play defensive end. First play, the ball's run to the right side. He makes it over to the right side because he susses out the play, tackles the carrier for a short gain. The next play is a run straight to him. Next 2 plays. no gain, then a tackle for a loss. These are him making the tackles. The upperclassmen get so upset with this that they start ganging up on him, and they attack him, brutalize him, single him out. He leaves at practice that day, that tryout that day, all bruised up and everything, and he goes and tells his brother, Ben, he's like, Ben, it's not worth it. I'm here on an academic scholarship. I don't need to play football. I'm just not going to play. In fact, I might even leave Rutgers. I think I'm going to go to Lincoln. But his brother said, no, the family needs you to be at Rutgers because of financial reasons. It's a free scholarship. You got to stay. And then on top of that, think about the next black person that's going to go to Rutgers. And the next black person that won't want to play football. You know you can make the team. You know you're good enough. Go back and try it again. So with that resolve from his family, he goes about the next day. And he's dominant again. And he's tackling people, and he's doing his things. And he goes to make one tackle, and he's kind of laying on the ground for a minute because he makes the tackle, and he's kind of trying to compose himself on the ground. And then this happens. And this is from an interview that he gave many years later about this. So I had stayed. I had 10 days in bed, a few days at the training table, and then out for another scrimmage. I made a tackle. It was on the ground. My right hand palm down on the ground. A boy came over and stepped hard on my hand and meant to break the bones. The bones held, but his cleats took every single one of the fingernails off my right hand. Every fingernail off my right hand. That's when I knew rage. You put that. Yeah. So this is what he writes about what happens next. So he's on the ground. His hand is messed up. And he actually writes in another book that it wasn't even so much the injury that hurt. It was the insult. So he gets up for the next play. The next play came around, my end. And the guy that did it is a running back, so he's the one holding the ball. The whole first string backfield came at me. I swept out my arms like this, like this. He's talking, and 3 men running interference went down. They just went down. So what he's saying is, there's 3 men that are trying to block him to not get to the running back. 3 men are coming at him. He just knocks 3 of them. Just boom, just knocks them down. This is how enraged he is. The ball carrier was a first-class back named Kelly. I wanted to kill him, and I meant to kill him. It wasn't a thought, it was just a feeling to kill. I got Kelly in my 2 hands like this, up over my head like this, and I was going to smash him so hard to the ground that I would break him right in 2, and I could have done it. But just then the coach yelled the first thing that came into his mind, Roby, you're on the varsity. That brought me around, and we laughed about it often later, and they all got to be my friends. So at this point, he has this guy up. So you got to imagine this scene. You got a left end, big 6'2" black man, knocking people out the way. 3 blockers, boom, 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 out the way. He's coming to the running back. He gets him, lifts him up in the air, and his intention is to drive him as hard as he can into the ground. He has him up in the air. The coach is yelling, you're on the varsity team, you're on the varsity team, please put him down. And he puts him down. From that point on, the team realized that all up until this point, he hasn't really played with rage. He hasn't really tried to hurt you, but he could if he wanted to. They were like, okay, he's on the team. He's on the team. So he said even Kelly, the guy that stepped on his hand, they would become friends and things. But you see what he had to go through just to show these folks that he belonged on the team. Well, he makes the team. And from then on, Rutgers becomes a powerhouse with him at end. And he plays defense and offense. On defense, he plays defensive end. And defensive end is one of the most important positions on the football field. If you watch the NFL draft, today, obviously, if there's a great quarterback is the most important position in football. If there's a great quarterback coming out of college, they're going to be picked number 1. But generally after that, left tackle and defensive end are probably the most important positions on a football field. Great defensive ends like Reggie White and J.J. Watt, T.J. Watt now plays for the Steelers, and other folks like that. They made a name for themselves attacking the quarterback, stopping runs for losses, that type of thing. That's how Paul Roberson played. He was a defensive end. On offense, he played tight end. And he was known for being a great catching tight end. He could jump higher than everybody else and catch the ball. So he could score on offense. He could stop plays on defense. He was a monster at football. In addition, he played basketball for Rutgers and was a standout. He threw the discus in track for Rutgers. He played baseball. He played catcher and which is one of the most physically demanding positions in baseball. If you know anything about the catcher, the ones that have to squat down and wait for the pitch. It's one of the hardest positions to play in baseball. And he got a varsity letter in that. So he played varsity baseball, varsity basketball, track, and football. But it's football that he most distinguished himself. He was named to the All-American team. This is when these things were first starting. And newspapermen would look at all the college players and say, who's the best of the best? And in 1917, he was named to his first All-American team. So you see him there, right there. And I just want to zoom in on this article so that you can see what it says about him. Roberson, best end. So they're saying he's the best end in the country. In the matter of development in this particular season, the top position must be accorded to Roberson. Roberson, the Negro end of Rutgers. Roberson was a good lineman last year, but he was a bit crude, and besides his worth, did not receive general recognition. With the rise of Rutgers this season, Roberson, with his superb strength, augmented by a knowledge of both the theory and practice of the finer points of football, soon proved himself one of the best forwards in the country. Roberson not only met the new football's myriad requirements of the end, he played the right end on defense, but also on attack. He usually took his place at tackle and opened up big holes through which Foster Sanford's backs marched to triumph. Actually, this is written by Wagner. His coach's name was Sanford. I got that mixed up. So, as you can see here, what I like about this quote, and this is a white writer who named the All-American team every year. And what I like about it is he mentioned Roberson's knowledge of the theory of football. One of the things that even these white writers would write about Roberson, he was one of the most intelligent football players on the field. Oftentimes, even today in 2023, when sports writers and sports journalists talk about black athletes, they usually always talk about their athleticism. Oh, he can jump so high, he can run so fast, he's so strong, he's this, that, and the third. But when they talk about white players, they say, oh, he's crafty. he's mentally dominating the game. So for 1917, for these white sports writers to talk about Roberson and his intellect on the field, and to recognize that, shows just how great he was. He was dominating the league. He would eventually graduate Rutgers. Actually, no. Before he graduated Rutgers, because he graduates in 1919. In 1918, his picture, along with another rising athlete who's at Brown University, another black athlete named Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard was a running back. So he's the best offensive player in the country. Paul Robeson is the best defensive player in the country, and they're both black. One is at Brown University, one is at Rutgers University. This picture in 1918 is in a newspaper, a periodical called The Crisis magazine, which was put out by the NAACP. And they recognized Paul Robeson as one of their men of the month in 1918. He's still in university. And this is that was the image that was associated with this article. It said, Paul Leroy Robeson. This athlete is only 19 years old, but he's 6 feet 2 inches high and weighs 210 pounds. That was big back in the day. He's the son of Reverend W.D. Robeson, and he graduated from this high school, and and it goes on to talk about him, and it talks about his exam. So already at 19 years old, he's in national black publications. Black people are already proud of him for the things that he's doing academically as well as athletically. Fritz Pollard is also going to become very influential in his life as well. We'll talk about him. He's the first black person to ever coach in the NFL. And then there wouldn't be another black coach for about another 50 years afterwards, because the NFL puts its own color line in. When people like Fritz Pollard and Paul Robeson start dominating the new NFL, then they say, all right, no more blacks. Just like baseball, no more blacks. Just like horse racing, no more blacks. Just like professional boxing for heavyweight championship, no more blacks. So he's doing all this athletically, and he's still achieving academically. He becomes a member of Phi Beta Kappa, the National Honor Society for the U.S. He becomes a member of the Kaplan Skull Society. Only 4 seniors in Rutgers are inducted into this organization, the Kaplan Skull Society. And a lot of these European white institutions have these societies. You know, the Skull and Bones, I think, is at Harvard or Princeton or something like that. They got these weird things going on. But this one's called Cap and Skull. So he was inducted, only one of 4 students at Rutgers to be inducted. He also joins Alpha Phi Alpha, the black fraternity, the oldest black college fraternity in the United States, started in 1906. A lot of prestigious black people are members of Alpha Phi Alpha. Martin Luther King is an Alpha, a lot of other folks. He joins the chapter at Lincoln University, even though he didn't go to Lincoln University. He's achieved so much that the Alphas at Lincoln, the new chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, say, we would like to induct you into our chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha. So he becomes an Alpha. And to become an Alpha, you have to achieve academically, you have to have a commitment to the black race. So that's what he does. So he's in all these honor societies, he's getting good grades, he's dominating, he's a 2-time All-American, he's the best football player in college football in the country. He ends up graduating from Rutgers in 1919. And he decides to go to law school. But he has to make money to go to law school because they weren't giving out any scholarships at this point. Got some support, but he decides to go to law school. So he starts playing professional football. Not because back in the day, professional football didn't pay like they paid today. And in fact, like I mentioned, football wasn't even I would say it wasn't even in the top, it may have been in the top 5. It may have been the 5th most popular sport in the US. But it wasn't the top 3. Horse racing, boxing, and baseball were the top 3. So he plays football for the Akron Pros. And who puts him on the team? Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard has started playing for the Akron Pros. This is a team out of Ohio, one of the first, and they win actually the first professional football championship, what would eventually become the NFL. The first championship was run by the Akron Pros in 1920. Roberson wasn't on the team yet. This is what Fritz Pollard was the running back. And they actually beat Jim Thorpe's team. Jim Thorpe was a great and indigenous American football player. But Fritz Pollard, in 1921, becomes the coach of the Akron Pros. Again, he's the first black coach in professional football. When Fritz Pollard becomes the coach, he's like, oh, Roberson's available? We getting him. So now you have like this all-star team with the best running back, Fritz Pollard. Then you got the best defensive end in Paul Robeson. And he, just like in college football, he starts dominating professional football. He starts dominating with the Akron Pros. Then he ends up playing for a team in Milwaukee. But I just want to read you this newspaper. And these clippings are available online as well. So you can kind of see what's going on. It says, Roberson is one of the greatest linemen ever turned out of the East. In addition to being a superlative player, both on defense and offense, he is able to hit the line when a few necessary yards are needed. While at Rutgers, he played in, and it was largely through his work that Cupid Black's naval team went down to defeat at the hand of Rutgers. An adept at plucking forward passes out of the air, and a wonderful player at diagnosing plays directed at his side of the line, Walter Camp, Dean of Football, chose this giant marvel in preference to a field of wonderful material. So this is how good he is. This is how good he is. He is that good on offense and defense. This came from one of the black newspapers. They said they went out to talk to Paul Robeson and said, literally speaking, that is the distance Paul Robeson, former All-American end, has been able to hurl a pigskin. He could throw a football from goal line to goal line. It's an amazing physical feat, if you could do that. There's been footage of Michael Vick throwing the ball large distances and but from 100 yards in the air, goal line to goal line. I don't know how true this is, but that's what they said. Roberson rated as the greatest defensive end in the history of the game. That's what they called him. Now, the game was only about 40 years old at the time, but at this point, he's the greatest defensive end in history. He's only been playing for like 3 years. He's the greatest end. One day, a discussion came up as to who could hurl the ball the furthest. Grasping the ball under one goalpost, Roberson let loose the ball, spiraling perfectly, landed but a few feet from the other goal line. Roberson, in addition to his remarkable ability as a football player, is also a fine singer and actor, which we'll talk about in a second. On the gridiron, he has few equals. He stands 6'4" and weighs 225 pounds, and it is believed in many circles that his heave has established a world record. So we see how good he is. And this is, I think, from either the Chicago Defender or the newspaper. So, the Pittsburgh Courier. He ends up going to Columbia Law School. And that last little bit in that newspaper clipping about him being a singer and an actor, Columbia is in New York. So he goes up to Columbia. So he's playing professional football to pay for his law degree. And he's doing well in law school. So let's add all of this up. Academically, achievement, check mark. Athletic achievement, best in the country, best athlete in the country by far. Now he's going to law school. Could you imagine somebody being this good at this many things? And that's not even the end of it. So he's going to law school, paying for law school by being a professional athlete. In his downtime, he's singing for people. And not just like, you know, we get in the car, we have our carpool karaoke, that type. He becomes a concert singer. So he would go to people and have these private get-togethers at the house, and he would sing. Because he used to sing with his brothers, he used to sing in church, and he has a magnificent voice. I mean, a great voice. He has damn near perfect pitch, they say. He had perfect pitch. So he's singing, and people are paying him to sing as well. So he's giving private concerts. Athlete, academic, law student, singer. And he's starting to dabble in acting a little bit on stage, on theater. So he's doing all these things. That singing and his notoriety as an athlete and as an academic is putting him into some very influential circles among black New Yorkers. And this is 1919, so or 1920. He's coming right into the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance, also called the New Negro Movement. He's hanging out at homes of James Weldon Johnson and his brother. James Weldon Johnson, his brother, I forget James Weldon Johnson's brother's name. Rosamond Johnson wrote the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. They wrote that. James Weldon Johnson was also a organizer with the NAACP. He was an activist, he was a composer, he was a poet, and they wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. Paul Robeson was a good friend of the Johnson brothers, sung many of their songs, hung out at their house, met people like W.E.B. Du Bois. And this is a later picture of Du Bois and Robeson, who are going to share a lot in common in terms of their anti-colonial stance, as well as their appreciation of socialism in the Soviet Union, but that comes later on. But Du Bois is active at this time and befriends Robeson. So Robeson is hanging out with a lot of giants in Harlem, a lot of people that are going to go on to be great poets and writers, people like Langston Hughes and Alain Locke and Zora Neale Hurston and others, this whole cadre of black intellectuals and artists who are all using their talents, again, not just to show how talented black people are, but also to uplift the race. So he's right in Harlem during the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance and working with all these people, and is one of the key figures in this movement. This is also during the time of Marcus Garvey. Now, later on, Garvey's going to have something to say about Robeson and some of the roles that he takes, but we'll talk about that moving forward. So he's right in the mix. He's one of the most known black people in the country at this time for athletics, but now he's starting to also make a name for himself as a singer. And he's doing all this while going to law school. As he graduates law school in 1923, and this is just a little bit about that's the New Negro Movement is what it was called, what's going on during this time in the 20s and 30s. So he goes to law school, finishes law school, but before he does, in 1920, he marries Eslanda Cardoza, who becomes Eslanda Robeson, his wife. They marry in 1920. It's kind of almost like the situation with his father and mother. And she comes from a very well-established black family out of D.C., the Cardozo family. They had some Spanish ancestry, black and Spanish, and light-skinned folks. And even when they get married, there's some family tension because of colorism, quite frankly, is what we're dealing with, and then classism as well. Because Robeson's making a name for himself, but it's not like he's rolling in money at the time. He's a graduate student that's playing football to pay for graduate school. So it's not like he's not the Paul Robeson yet. He's just Paul Robeson. So her family was kind of, we don't know about this guy type thing. But they end up marrying in 1920. And as he's making his way out of law school, he's doing the singing, doing a little acting here and there. We'll get into that next week. He's starting to see what it's like to be a stage actor. And his wife, Eslanda, he calls her Essie, is encouraging him to, you know, keep up with the singing. Give this acting thing a try. She's pushing him to do these things. And it really comes to a head, and this is where we'll stop today, in 1923. So he graduates law school. He actually gets a job working for a white law firm in New York. And he's ready to start his career as a lawyer. So, you know, again, another one of these respectable jobs for black folks. And he's working at the law firm, and he has some paperwork he needs to do. And the white stenographer at the law firm says, "I'm not taking dictation from a nigger." She tells him straight up like that. "I'm not taking dictation from a nigger." That day, he leaves the law firm, talks it over with his wife, Eslanda, and he said, "I don't know if I want to do this law thing because they're going to relegate me to just working in black communities. Many black communities can't even afford lawyers. I don't know what this is going to be able to do for me. I don't think I'm going to go into law." She said, "Well, let's think about this singing and acting. I think you can definitely make a go of it. I believe in you. I believe in your talent. Let's see where this goes." So by the time this article was written in 1924, a year later, "I owe my success to my wife," says Paul Roberson, as he's about to star in Eugene O'Neill's drama Emperor Jones. We'll talk about that next week as Paul Roberson begins his career as one of possibly the greatest actor of his generation. So already athlete, academic, lawyer, singer, and then we're gonna get into him as an actor and where that takes him. So that's what we'll pick up with next week. So stay with us. Go to the course website. You can look at some of the materials and that course website is always evolving. There will always be more things added to it, so it's not in its finished state. But there are a number of materials and videos that you can look at to kind of see where we're going with this week's discussion and into next week. So a lot of things there. Get these books if you can and read them. And we will stop there today. We'll open it up to any questions, comments, community announcements, that type of thing. So Daniel, anything in the chat or are there any hands?
There's nothing in the chat, but David has a question.
Thank you. And thank you for an excellent class, Dr. Ledbetter. And maybe I'm hearing incorrectly or I missed some disclaimer at the beginning, but during your lecture you made it very clear that when you're using the word black to describe the culture and the people, that it's a subclass and therefore this Mr. Roberson is excelling when he steps out of that class or that lower level and achieves all these accolades and does well professionally. And this is exceptional because he's coming from that disadvantage. And when he goes into his law practice and singing and acting career, this is exceptional because he has that disadvantage of being, and as you phrased it, black. So the negative connotation with the word is there. You're using it to show the contrast. Why are we continuing to propagate this?
If I did that, it's not intentional, and I don't think that I did. When I'm saying he's exceptional, not because he broke out of anything black, but just